We just finished a meeting in here, and it was rather an interesting meeting. One of the cities nearby here is faced with the problem of having to reroute traffic in order to do some bridge repair. They have several alternative routes that they can look at. The one that is most acceptable to the city council, the highway department, the business community, is one wherein the traffic will have to be routed across a bridge that was built in 1902. Now, the serious question that they have to face is the bridge still stable and solid enough to carry the kind of traffic that rerouting will impose on it? One of the last speakers here today was a technical expert, that is a structural engineer, who had made an analysis of the capabilities of that bridge. Now, based on the information that he presented, a decision will be made. Now, I'm not interested in whether the decision will be a good one or a bad one. What fascinates me is that after all of the conversation that has gone on, one of the most critical elements of input is based on how well that engineer communicated clearly and concisely the technical information. And that's what this series is going to be about, and that is the presentation of technical information.
Over the last 15 or 20 years, there have been a number of significant changes in the technical industries that have tended to have an impact on the role of an engineer. To start with, I think one looks back to the aerospace changes and the nature of the rapidly expanding state-of-the-art. In many cases, as evolution of the industrial products took place at an ever-increasing rate, the engineer, the individual who designed, was the only person who could go before the customer or go before the funding agency and to explain how a system worked. So we find engineers placed into a circumstance of being presenters of information. A second major change is the rapid growth that has taken place in a tremendous number of industries. For instance, there's been a growth in the computer industry, there has been a growth in the energy industry, all of whom have tended to absorb engineers at an ever-increasing rate and have tended to promote them at an ever-increasing rate. So that people who were originally hired to do a straightforward engineering job very quickly found themselves in a supervisory and ultimately into a management position that required that they be a part of the decision-making process. And finally, I think in the last 5 or 10 years, we've seen the increase in what is called participatory governance. That is, that individuals outside of the industry have in many cases been brought in and have seriously asked questions about what are you doing, how does it function, what are the impacts, and again, it is the engineer that must come forward with the answer. All of these things have led to one result, is that in the last 5 or 10 years, we increasingly see engineers responsible for standing in front of non-technical audiences and making technical presentations. So this series is designed to assist you in determining how you can make better technical presentations. Now, I think when we talk about making better technical presentations, it's important that we understand what the basic premises are from which we're going to operate. If nothing else, these are my biases that are based on a number of years of serving as a consultant to the engineering industries. To begin with, I think it's very important to make a distinction between the activities or the process, if you will, that is associated with getting engineering work done and the process that is associated with communicating the results of that work. In the process of engineering, that's what we would call a technical activity. The design, the testing, all of these elements are technical processes, a technical activity. But once it's done, and you reach the point where you're now standing in front of an audience to report, that is not a technical activity, it's a human activity. Communication is at its very roots a relationship that exists between a human being and another human being. So the subject matter can be as technical as you want it to be, but the process of relating content is a process of human-to-human relationship. So that's bias or premise number one. Now, premise number two. Although I would like to offer you an option, there is one thing that you have got to come to grips with immediately. If you want to make better technical presentations, there is no substitute for thorough and complete preparation. Now, there's a lot of people who get into what we call the non-expert versus the expert syndrome. They say, look, non-experts, they got to go out and do a little research, and they got to gather their ideas together, and they've got to become prepared with the content. The expert doesn't need to do that. The expert's got all the information. I mean, they live with it, they work with it day after day. What is there to research? Now, preparation here is not a matter of going out and finding what to talk about. For the expert, it's a problem of determining what not to talk about. We're going to discuss that in detail later on as to how you prepare. But it's very much like any professional activity that you're going to engage in. The professional does the necessary preparation in order to lead to a final solid result. It's the non-professional we find attempting to engage in an activity and then discovering they're not prepared to do it. So the second premise, preparation. Now, the third premise is, frankly, that the act of communicating through the spoken word, when we're talking about making a technical presentation, is unlike any other kind of technical communication because it is dynamic and not static. Let me make a distinction, for instance, between technical writing and technical speaking. If you prepare an article or a report or a status report or a document of some sort, you can write it, and then you might rewrite it, and you edit it, and possibly you send it on, somebody else massages a little bit more. But when the document is completed, it is then packaged in some way or other and then sent off. And then the receiver of the information, the reader, reads it. But when the reader has it in hand, it doesn't change at all. It is a fixed communicative entity. Now, that's not true when you're standing in front of an audience, because what is going on in front of an audience is something that is constantly fluctuating. We'll talk about feedback in a few minutes, but when you stand in front of an audience and talk to them, the kinds of things that they give you back, verbal or nonverbal, are going to influence what you're doing, what you're saying, how it is developed, and you have a constantly flexible circumstance going on. So the third premise is essentially that you have a flexible, dynamic circumstance. Now, those are the premises, and you're going to hear me come back to them over and over and over again. Now, with those premises in mind, I want to do a quick overview of what these series of programs are all about. We want to first of all focus on the process of communication itself in order to kind of establish the ground rules and a common language so that when we discuss other things, you're going to know what I'm talking about. All right, the second element is we're going to focus in on the audience. That is, how to determine what the audience gives you in terms of strengths, what the audience gives you in terms of negatives, to talk about how to analyze an audience, when to analyze an audience, how to handle an audience during the presentation, all of those elements. The third portion of the series is going to deal with the message as structure, how you determine your main ideas, how do you organize the main ideas, how do you do transitions so that they have a continuity and a wholeness. The fourth portion deals with graphics. Why do you use visual aids? When do you use visual aids? What constitutes a good visual aid? What kind of equipment do you use for visual aids? How do you use the equipment effectively? All of those things. And then finally, the last series of programs will deal with what do you do when you're standing in front of the audience? What is generally called the delivery. Now, by the way, I hope you notice the delivery comes last. Now, that comes last, by the way, for two reasons. One, it comes last because there is a whole lot of work that goes on before you make a technical presentation. That's kind of an end result. That's the visible tip of the iceberg. The second reason for putting it last is, frankly, that's the easiest part of doing a technical presentation. I don't expect you to believe me, by the way, but just wait, and maybe I can establish that. Now, communication, and even the technical presentation kind of communication, is a pretty broad kind of topic to have to deal with. Where do you get started on something like this? Well, I want to fall back on a technique that's being used more and more today in the teaching of technical communication, and that's to talk about the model of the communication process itself. The model is a relatively simple one, by the way. You can find much, much more complex ones than this, but I think it's enough to identify that first. You start with ideas or content. From content, you become a speaker in order to have a sender relationship. The next element is the message itself. That is how the content is packaged. The next element is the listener, the receiver end, the audience, if you will, who receives the message. Now, that is also translated a little bit into the idea of they end up with content somewhere along the line. And then kind of connecting this whole thing together is what we call feedback. Because even while you're sending a message, you've got information coming back to you from the receiver that influences what you send, and so on and so forth into a circle. Now, one thing that's important to bear in mind when you look at and consider the model, we can talk about how effective a technical presentation is. But when you get down to it, a technical presentation is effective when what you wanted to express, the content that was in your mind when you started, ends up in the mind of the listening audience. Not in the hand, by the way. If they have to refer to a set of copious notes to figure out what you said, then they haven't understood what you've said. So we're talking about what goes on between the mind of the speaker and the mind of the listener. Now, with that model in mind, I think possibly the best place to begin to discuss the components is to begin at that element that reflects why you're watching this to start with. And I suspect most of you are watching this because you want to become better speakers. So let's start by looking at the role of the speaker. Now, one of the first things that I think it's important to recognize when we talk about the role of engineer as speaker is to recognize the fact that you are a human being. Now you say, hey, it's a big deal, of course we're human beings, but a lot of people forget that. I don't know how many audiences that I have sat in on where I get the impression that the speaker is fulfilling the role of some kind of warm, pulsating tape recorder. There's a kind of a data resource that grinds its way through information. That's not the way humans relate to each other. That's the human aspect that you've got to be aware of. Look, you are a person, you are who you are, you talk to other people. It's that simple. Now, there's another element that goes along with this, though. Human beings do relate well to one another, but they relate best when they're in the physical presence of one another. Now, I'll bet every one of you at some time has had a rather sensitive message to communicate. Well, you got to know that the worst way to do that is to write a memo, because the written word is subjected to an awful lot of misinterpretation. The kind of the tone of the voice gets lost, and you get a lot of opportunities for breakdown. Now, if it's a serious thing that you want to be sure you get across, isn't it better you go to the telephone at least? Right now, the telephone gives you a chance for voice feedback. You can hear things about what people are saying, get immediate feedback, and all of those things. But if you really want to get a point across, the best way to do it, as you well know, is to have a conversation. That is to sit down across the table from somebody, eyeball to eyeball, and talk to them about what you want to get across. Then you have the opportunity for them to feed back to you both verbally, non-verbally, and you have a real interrelationship going. And I think it's important to recognize that that's kind of the key to good technical presentations. Now, a friend of mine once defined good technical presentations as nothing more than thoughtfully prepared conversation. You know, I think that's worth spending a couple of minutes on. Consider, if you will, what your responsibilities are when you talk about standing in front of an audience to present technical information. Your first responsibility is always going to be to maintain the integrity of the technical content. As a professional, when you communicate information to people sitting in front of you, you want to be sure that what you say reflects your best professional judgment. Now, you can't do that without thinking through what it is you're going to do. That is, preparing your ideas, getting them in the right sequence, making sure that you've got what you want. But it doesn't do any good, does it, to have the right information if you don't get it across to anybody? That's the second part of it. That's why the conversational thing is so critical. Now, every one of you has been engaging and practicing your public speaking skills since you were probably 2 years of age. That's about the age where we begin to engage in real conversation. Now, that's a lot of years of experience. Now, don't throw it away just because you happen to be standing behind one of these things. And time again, I see people do it, fully capable of conversing with one person. And when they get up here, they start to role play. They begin to think, now, this is unusual or unique or different. It is not. The same thing that you do here is the same thing that you do when you talk to people one-on-one. If you can carry on a conversation with one person, you can carry it on with 2, 20, 200. There is no practical limit. Part of what goes into this is, what do you carry up here in your mind? It's your own attitude that makes the difference. And it's the conversational attitude that I think will bring you closer to really making better technical presentations. Now, with all of this going for you, by the way, then why do so many people have so much trouble? There's got to be some kind of an interference. Well, there is. We call it stage fright. Now, you've all been through this, and I guess I sympathize with it. You know, you stand in front of an audience, and especially for the first time, and what happens is you look out there and you discover that everybody in the whole world is looking that way, and you're looking that way, all right? Everybody else is sitting down and you're standing up. Everybody else is quiet and you're talking. And the rather comfortable thing to do is to turn around, sit down, shut up. Now, that works out well if you're doing public speaking as a hobby. But what happens if someone says, you will make a technical presentation? This is part of your job responsibility. It is something that goes into your performance evaluation. You don't have the option anymore. Then we got to do something else then to reduce the impact of stage fright. Now, first of all, I think it's important to understand what stage fright is. It's nothing else, by the way, than acute self-consciousness. You get up here and all of a sudden you begin to worry about how do you look, how do you sound, and your whole focus of attention tends to be turned back towards you. Now, if stage fright is caused by being a focus of attention on yourself, then the obvious way to reduce it is focus in on something else. But that creates a problem too. What else do you focus on? Now, we've got a lot of choices involved. I've seen an awful lot of speakers will focus on the top of the podium. And that's not threatening, by the way. Rarely do you find someone threatened by the top of a podium. On the other hand, you have people who love graphics. And they'll put something up on a screen, and they stand and they focus on the screen. And again, there's no stage fright. Why should you be frightened of a graphic? Unfortunately, in both cases, there's no communication either. Now, I think the easiest thing in the world to do is to focus on the receiver, the people sitting in front of you. Now, that's what you do in conversation, isn't it? And it's really remarkable that you rarely will find an individual who suffers stage fright when engaging in a conversation. But there's a second thing that's, I think, very critical to understand about stage fright. Another reason why people will suffer from stage fright is when they don't know what they're talking about. As they get up there, and all of a sudden they begin to realize they don't know what they're doing. They don't know what the idea is that they're supposed to talk about, and they're unprepared. And all I can say is that if you suffer from stage fright because you're not prepared, then relax and enjoy it because you earned it. Now, I've heard a lot of rationales from various people about why they don't have time to prepare. That's your judgment to make. If communication on your job is important, then the time to do it will be there. But when you talk about how to prepare, brings us right back to the idea of what is to prepare. And I think it's important first to talk about the methods that people use to prepare the message itself. And these, I think, are relatively easy to look at. When we look at the structure of a presentation, I think it's easy to understand that the structure remains pretty much the same regardless of the content. Now, every presentation is a different presentation, but you're always going to see three things that ought to be in every one of them. The three things are an introduction, a body or development, and a conclusion. Now that's kind of a, an English 1101 type of response, but I think there's maybe an easier way to remember that. There is a story told that I'm sure is apocryphal about a minister who was successful in giving sermons. Somebody once asked him, "How are you able to do it so well?" And he replied by saying, "It's really very simple. I tell them what I'm going to tell them, then I tell them, then I tell them what I told them." Now tattoo that on your cortex, because we're going to come back to that over and over and over again. Now what do we mean then? Tell them what you're going to tell them. That's the introduction. Now the introduction to a presentation usually contains, or ought to contain, three elements. First, it ought to introduce the subject matter. That is, this is what you're going to talk about. Secondly, it should involve the audience in some way or other. That is, to give them a rationale as to why they ought to listen to the presentation. And third, and possibly most important of all, the introduction should overview the entire presentation. That is, if you have a 4-point presentation to make, then in the introduction you say, I have 4 things I want to talk about, 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'd like to give you a kind of a little demonstration of an introduction, and I'll quickly kind of set the scene. Suppose you have someone who is involved in the process of talking about or selling PRT, Personal Rapid Transit. Stands in front of an audience made up of mostly non-technical people representing city government, state government. Thank you very much for the introduction, Mr. Johnson. Ladies and gentlemen, my responsibility this afternoon is to discuss the economic aspects of your consideration of a project towards Personal Rapid Transit, or PRT. I'm sure that you are all aware that the economics associated with this is of critical concern to all the parties who are represented. To do that, there are 4 things that I want to cover today. First, I want to talk about the overall funding of the project. Secondly, I want to talk about the cost of maintenance as compared to the current cost of maintenance of our highway systems. Thirdly, I want to talk about the economic impacts associated with transportation support industries. And finally, I want to talk about the economic impacts as they are associated with the consumer or the user of PRT. Now, looking at the overall funding, I think the place where we have to begin is to talk about the role of the federal government. Now, there are a couple of things about that introduction that I hope you noticed. There was a clear statement about what the speaker was going to cover. There was a clear statement of why they ought to be involved in it. And then each one of the 4 ideas was clearly set for the audience. Now remember, the introduction not only tells them where they're going to go, but it's the first point where the speaker begins to reinforce the main ideas in the minds of the audience. They hear it clearly and simply. No data, no distraction, just the ideas. Now, getting out of a presentation is also a critical factor in making a good, solid technical presentation. Now, we're going to talk about body and development later, by the way, so we're just focusing on introduction and conclusion now. When we talk about ending a speech, I don't know how many times as I listen to technical presentations, I hear the speaker finish the last word of the last subpoint of the last main idea and just die. Ooh, that's all I've got. Are there any questions? Now, that's not going to do it. The last 30 to 40 to 50 seconds of a presentation, or the last minute or 2, depending on the overall length, are critical times in the terms of the listening capability of the audience. A lot of times what really calls for focus of attention is what follows the words, now in conclusion. That's when people really start to pay attention. Let's go back to the PRT presentation and listen. So you can see that we end up with the commuter ultimately saving as much as 28% over the current cost of transportation. The casual user of the system 13% over current costs, and that the occasional shopper, as we've called them, as much as 8%. In conclusion, I want to review briefly what we have discussed. We talked first about the project funding at the highest level. That is the government funding, the state and local funding, and the bond issue funding. Secondly, we discussed the maintenance cost, indicating that overall we can indicate a lower cost of maintenance over our current system. Finally, we talked about the economic impact on transportation support services, admitting that there's going to be some disruption. And finally, we've talked about the cost to the consumer, indicating that in the long run, it's a cheaper method of transportation. Now, at this point, I would like to ask if there are any further questions on the economic impacts of PRT. Now, I want you to notice about that conclusion, by the way, how closely it was tied to the introduction. That is, the same focus of attention on the four main ideas. But in this case, a little bit more information has been added. Doesn't end up on that visual, by the way. He ends up going back to the broader view of the presentation. That's what gives it cohesiveness. Now, I keep talking about this introduction and conclusion being kind of prepared in advance. And I think that it's kind of a good approach to start talking about how do you prepare the presentation overall. And I think there are four basic methods of preparing presentations that have been used traditionally. I want to talk about each one of them. The one that I think is most dangerous of all, by the way, is what is called the impromptu presentation. I'll ask the one where there isn't any preparation at all. You're forced into this sometimes at a typical business meeting, you know, where you walk in and you've not seen an agenda and somebody asks you for a status report on your department. When you can't say, I'm sorry, I require 8 hours notice before I speak, because you end up getting 2 weeks notice. So you give them whatever you got. An impromptu presentation is one where it's right off the top of the head. Whatever is lying around in the cortical layers at the moment is what you give. The only danger of the impromptu presentation is that, first of all, it requires you to create and deliver a presentation at the same time. Second problem with it, what happens when you forget critical data? For some reason, it just doesn't occur to you at that moment. Somehow or other, you have to go back over it. And then, of course, there's always the problem associated with saying the wrong thing. Now, that second kind of preparation is the extemporaneous presentation. And that's the one where you know in advance you're going to give a technical presentation. In advance may be a day in advance, 8 hours, 3 months, 6 months, whatever it happens to be, but you have some kind of advance warning. You can use that time then to prepare for the audience, to think in terms of what it is you want to say, how it's going to be organized, how it's going to be visualized. If it's a critical presentation, you can even give a dry run. You can rehearse it a couple of times. As a matter of fact, the extemporaneous presentation allows you to do everything. Everything is prepared in advance except one thing. You do not prepare the words in advance, only the ideas. Now, the reason for this is very simple. We go back to your twofold requirement as an engineer. One, the integrity of the data. Secondly, the freedom to talk to people in a conversational way. The extemporaneous presentation gives you that kind of freedom. You're not tied to trying to create. You're not tied to specific words. You use your conversational ability just to look at people, eyeball them, and talk to them as you talk to people in all kinds of circumstances. So I think the extemporaneous presentation is possibly the strongest. Now, let me go on. There are people who say, yeah, Conley, I get up there, though, and I can't think of any words that, you know, aren't either heavy technical or obscene or something, and they want to go one step further, and they want to prepare the words, too. And that's called the manuscript presentation. Now, there are two problems with a manuscript presentation. One, it's extremely difficult to write a manuscript that sounds like a presentation. Now, you've all been to professional conventions. You know what that's like. You go into one of the sessions and somebody's going to deliver their paper on some advanced technology, and that's just exactly what they do. They stand in front of you as if they assume you cannot read, and then they read it aloud to you. And it sounds like they're reading a written paper aloud. The language of the spoken presentation and the language of a written document are always going to be slightly different. And it's very, very difficult to find a manuscript or find someone who can write a manuscript that sounds like a presentation. But there's a second problem with it. Even if you've got a good manuscript, think about what it's like to stand at a podium, attempt to follow word for word verbatim what's going on, maintain eye contact, and try to sound spontaneous all at once. It's an extremely difficult thing to do. And what you end up with all too frequently is something like this. Now let's review where we are today. The Dresden 1 plant began commercial operation, or production rather, in 1961. Since this beginning, the BWR design has evolved. The BWR design has evolved. And a succession of product lines have been introduced as summarized in Table 1.1. The BWR-2, represented by Oyster Creek, is the first modern light water reactor plant. Now recently, the BWR-6 product product line was introduced, which incorporates several changes.
Excuse me, please.
Does that sound familiar to any of you? I don't know how many conventions I have sat in and listened to that kind of manuscript delivery. And actually leads us then to the fourth kind. And there are people who say, Connolly, you're right, I can't handle a manuscript. So they go with what's called the memorized presentation. Now, I could tell you horror stories all day about people who have memorized presentations and then stand in front of an audience and forget one word. Now, the memorized presentation is the kind of thing that I think belongs with theatrical presentations where you are actually a performer. Now, look, if you look at the four kinds, the impromptu is non-professional. The manuscript is almost impossible to handle. The memorized sets you up, for all kinds of horror stories. Obvious, isn't it? The extemporaneous method is the one that I recommend. As a matter of fact, the following programs in this series are all going to be based on using the extemporaneous method of preparation as the key to making a better technical presentation. Now, where have we gone, if you will, on this first program? We're just really trying to touch some of the basics. We talked a little bit about the premises on which we're operating in terms of the entire series on making better technical presentations. We've touched a little bit on the model, and so far we have only identified two parts of the model. We spent a few minutes talking about the speaker. We spent a little bit talking about the message. We'll have much more. On our next program, what we want to do is to focus on what in the long run is probably the most critical of all of the elements of the model, and that is the audience.